Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. Thanks for being here. We're going to continue on in this fashion where I'm just going to speak off the cuff here and answer subscriber questions because I've been compiling a ton of subscriber questions. And, over the last several months, I've probably averaged talking to more than 100 elk hunters every week. And so I've accumulated a lot of repeat questions and tried to rank those out and compile those with what's asked most often about elk hunting across social media, across internet forums. And the next question that I came across that seems to be really prevalent in a lot of folks' minds, especially in a year like this where a lot of the West has heat and drought, and people are worried about those conditions and ever growing pressure, that we're all dealing with, whether that's hunters or predators. And so the next question that seems to be the most important to you guys is, Matt, what do I do when the elk just aren't bugling, when those bulls aren't talking, right? And that could be for any number of reasons, right? It could be because of the time of the season. Maybe it's just early, and they just don't have a reason to talk yet. Maybe it's because of pressure, could be human pressure or predator pressure, right? Furry predator pressure. Yeah. And, it could also be because of heat, because of drought, because of smoke in a lot of areas. We've got a ton of wildfires going on and people struggling with their areas getting burned and things of that nature and changing the game. And so I want to address all of that. And for me, the number one play that we use as our primary tactic when the elk aren't talking. And this works whether the elk are talking or whether they're not talking. And so it's an important concept to understand no matter what. But when they are not talking, then the number one play for us is hunting a transition zone. And so the number one question I get is, Matt, what do I do when the elk aren't talking? But a huge question that I get as well is, what is a transition zone? How do I locate a transition zone? What does that look like? How do I find it? How do I use it to hunt elk? So we're kind of going to smash both of those together, talk about what to do when the elk aren't talking, and that's use a transition zone. Now I want to talk about the transition zone itself and what that looks like and how we use it. So I've got my handy dandy whiteboard out here. We'll see how this goes. I don't know how many takes of this I'm going to have to do till I get a version of it that I like, but we'll just do the best we can here and see how this turns out for us. So what I'm going to show you is what I would describe as an ideal transition zone. Okay. So they're going to come in many, many shapes and sizes, right? The variety out there is endless. Yours might not look like this. I'm probably going to come across hundreds of transition zones this season, hunting 3 different states for elk that all look a little bit different and have different properties to them. But I'm going to describe a pie in the sky, perfect transition zone to you, and then you'll be able to more easily adapt that to your area, right? And so the first thing that I'm going to do when I'm trying to determine a transition zone is I'm going to try to determine where the feeding is, right? Where the food is, because it's an easier piece of country to try to figure out, right? Now, what is a transition zone? That's a huge question. Maybe I should have started with that. Well, a transition zone is simply the area between where elk are feeding and where they're bedding, right? So in the morning, elk are going to transition from their feeding area to their bedding area. Everything in between those two areas is the transition zone. And then in the evening, they're going to flip that, right? They're going to go from bedding back through the transition zone to feed. Okay. Now, for our sake and purposes here, we're just going to say that we've got some feed down in a drainage. It's down lower, okay, in the area that we're checking out. And I'm just going to mark that with an F right here for feed. I'm going to put a kind of a bubble around it and picture meadows out in this general area. Maybe there's some wallows lining this edge, some trees, throughout. But generally, we're going to recognize this as a feeding area down here. Right. So after I've found the feeding area, your parks, your meadows, your timber edges, your burns, all kinds of areas like that, then we want to look at, okay, if I were an elk and I was going to go from feed to bed, where would I most likely bed? All right. So typically the feeding area might happen more towards the south side or the lower end of the south slopes, right? A little better food in there sometimes. And so what we're going to do first is look if this is at the bottom of the south side or on a south facing slope, then, or maybe a southwest facing slope, then I'm going to look for where is the most likely bedding. And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times that could be on a north facing slope, right? Or a northeast facing slope. So let's just draw a bubble up here and say that this is the other side of the ridge and this is where they're going to go bed. All right. So I'm a terrible artist. Please don't judge me. So anything in between the feeding area and the bedding area could be a transition zone. I'll have guys, though, that really think about transition zones like I'm talking about a very specific pinch point, like a saddle or maybe a bench or something like that. Now, those are things that could absolutely be present in a transition zone, but they don't have to be there. All right. So this one that I'm imagining here that we hunt a lot, that is one of our most successful local transition zones that we hunt. This feeding area here is probably, if we were to go along the timber edge here, it's probably at least 400 to 600 yards long down there, maybe a little bit longer. You might be pushing up towards a half a mile where there's broken meadows down through the bottom of this guy. Okay. No big creek down there, just a lot of little water pockets. Must be a little bit of, spring activity in there that's feeding these water pockets in these mountain meadows. And so it could be very long. They could go up anywhere that they wanted to from that feed towards that bed if they wanted to go up and find their bedding area. All right. But this particular transition zone and why it's ideal for me is because there's a saddle up here at this end, okay, of the transition zone. And so what we found was there are a few trails that come up out of the feeding area and they all point up there towards that saddle. So that is a huge clue. When we found the feed and we found the bed, generally we know this is a transition zone, which is great, even if you just have those two pieces of information to be able to get in there ahead of elk. You're not chasing elk if you're in that transition zone, right? Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post-Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory. It's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. And so for quiet elk that aren't bugling, this is extremely important to be able to be in that transition zone. If you can be in there in the dark, waiting on these elk that are feeding down here to transition up through there as it gets light, then you're already ahead of those guys. In that case, some soft calling can really easily pull those elk over that are curious and they're just herd social animals anyway, can pull them over to check out that sound. And a lot of times we'll just set up below the lower trail in these transition zones. And sometimes we don't have to say a word and those elk are just walking down the trail and we're below it 20, 30 yards with good wind. And the magic can happen just that way, just that easy without even calling. But when you compile the feed and bed knowledge through a transition zone and you add trails, you layer trails on top of it, and you have a pinch point like a saddle here that a lot of the elk are going to go over. Now, this one here that I'm talking about isn't super steep, so they could go up anywhere, but they're a little bit opportunistic, elk are, right? So they do transition along those trails up to the saddle often, quite often, a majority of the elk. So that gives us a huge roadmap for how we're going to get ahead of them. Another piece of this puzzle is for us, once you're near the top of this ridge here, there is a bench that runs for several hundred yards along there as well. Really flat. It's probably only maybe 80 to 100 yards deep in places, but it absolutely has its own trail system on it. Also, kind of going down towards the saddle. And while we haven't found any elk bedded on this particular bench, we have found a lot of sign, a lot of rubs in here, a lot of fresh tracks, a lot of fresh poop. And so I think what happens a lot of times in this one is they're coming up from that feed somewhere there and they're hitting that bench and then they're traveling to the saddle and going over via the bench right there. Okay. And so they're piling up down here in this corner somewhere, could be 100 to 200 acres where they're bedding down in there most commonly, but it still gives us direction where they're headed over the top of the mountain. Yeah. So if we take into account all of those factors that are layered in there, this starts to look really appealing, right? This is a sexy looking transition to me. I get super excited about something like this. Now, how can we make this transition even better? Because it's already amazing. Well, down here at the far end of the transition where the meadows kind of die off, it ends up getting kind of choked out down here, and not in a choked out way that elk necessarily love. Right back here on the other side of the saddle where it comes down, it ends up being it's kind of steep and open and rocky, not exactly a cliff, but absolutely a barrier right there. And then just to this side of it, it is very thick in there, a lot of deadfall and whatnot. So if you have, this is still the south side, right? So if you have elk transitioning through, and this is still the south side, and maybe they prefer that cooler north facing or northeast facing slope over there, chances are good that even though this gets a little bit thick right here, that it's probably not going to be ideal for them if they have their choice. And when it borders this open, cliffy type stuff that's real rocky in through there, this just ends up being a narrow strip. And I just don't think that they're super confident in the amount of cover and security that narrow strip gives them. They're much more likely to hop over the top. So now we've just got even more layers in here, right? So this particular transition zone that I'm talking about here, we took all of our elk camp folks in. So we ran 3 elk camps this summer. All 3 of those guys went in here on the second day on Saturday with us, and we ran calling scenarios in the transition zone all day long. It was amazing. We call them elk war games, right? And they're just phenomenal. We play solo games. We do a ton of tandem setups where we've got caller and shooter, and then guys are rotating. And my son is the bull, Saxton from Wild Born Outdoors. Unbelievable, uncanny caller, and we have called in hundreds of bulls together, maybe more, and he is half elk, I think, at this point. So he knows how those elk are going to respond. We've called in dozens of elk and killed many in this particular spot, and so he can even run through scenarios that happened in his mind and how those elk played this transition coming into a little bit of sound. And so guys are running this all Saturday for us during elk camp. We will run a scenario and then we circle back up and we talk about everything that went well and the areas of improvement. I'm making notes the whole time. We've got it on video. There's pressure aspect to it because of that, because they're being critiqued, they're being watched by other hunters, they're on video, and they really want to get that bull killed. And he doesn't give them any handouts. He makes them earn it if they're going to kill him, right? And so what was really interesting about this, we were running camp number 1 down here, and some of the guys had never even called before. Some of them were pretty decent callers, but some of them had never called before. So we're making all kinds of racket. Real elk noise, real bugling, real cow calling down in there. We're talking, but because this is such a prevalent area, midday, about 1 o'clock, we look down a little over 100 yards from us, and two bulls had come over the ridge and down here to get water out of some wallow areas, some wet areas that are down there in that feeding area that's still protected by trees. And so it just really stood out as an area that is just beautiful. It works. The elk are using those transition zones, not only in the morning and the evening, but in the middle of the day as well. Now, just a quick note about this. I feel like transition zones are a little bit stronger in the morning. And the reason for that is we can get in there in the dark, and then it's just getting lighter and lighter and lighter, right? And so you've got hours to play with in there that they might be transitioning up. We have killed bulls at 6:05 in the morning right here coming into this transition zone. We're tucked away down in this, what I call the corner pocket. We've had elk come right up this little trail here from the feeding area and nailed them right here. We've also had elk walk up the trail at 11 o'clock in the morning. They should have already been transitioned and bedded. What made them come there? I don't know, but it worked, right? Because it's a transition zone. It's a prime time area between the feed and the bed. We have had elk that I think came up, hit that bench, and were working along, and then they've come down to us on numerous occasions. What we haven't had happen very often, and one of the reasons why I love this corner pocket, is we haven't had them come down in the morning from behind us. And so it really helps us play the wind there, to play the thermals and really understand what those elk are doing first thing in the morning. Now, in the evening, I feel like transition zones aren't always as good as they are in the morning, because oftentimes the elk are going to stage until really close to dark, especially in high pressured areas. And so they may be up on their feet on that north side, but they may not be willing to break down into those transition zones, especially if they're open at all, or head out into that feed until right at dark. Now, this particular transition zone is in a lot of trees. There's still a lot of protection and security in there. And so we will get them transitioning down in the evening. What they don't do is just step out here into the open feed area in broad daylight. They generally tend to stage at the timber edge in here if they've transitioned down there during shooting light. But they can still be extremely valuable areas. Just know what you're hunting. When we hunt transitions, we are not hunting the feed area. And I'm personally not pushing into bedding area. Now, get a elk bugling up here at 10, 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the day because he's with cows that are bedded? Absolutely, I'm going to go after him. 100%. Now, I'm not going to go in the bedding area where I'm going to bump everything out of there, but I'm going to try to get inside the bubble 80 to 120 yards, being as aware of not busting out that bedding area as I can, and then talk to him, pull him off that bed when he knows those cows are secure. So there's a few of the ways that we hunt a transition zone, what an ideal one looks like, and hopefully that helps you start to narrow down some of your areas, thinking about finding feed, finding bed. How can I get in there and hunt that transition zone in between those two? That is the number one play on elk that are silent, that aren't talking, whether it's because it's early September, whether it's because they are afraid of human pressure or wolf pressure, or because it's hot and dry and that's throwing them out of whack and they want to focus in on particular watery areas, right? But they're nervous about, whether they're going to get hunted from a predator or human, same thing, right? Around that water. Or maybe it's really smoky and that has completely changed their behavior because their senses are suppressed. That sense of smell is messed up because of the smoke, right? Doesn't matter what the reason is. Transition zone is my number one play on security elk. I hope this has helped you out. If you have heard some of this and you've realized that maybe you need a better elk plan this season, I'd really encourage you to hop on backboneunlimited.com, sign up for my elk hunt plan audit. You get to send me maps. You get to fill out a questionnaire that I'll send you that's going to take all your specific details on how you plan to hunt your area. And I'm going to give you all kinds of goodies in a 30+ page report back on how I might adjust your plan and help you structure a plan if you need one going forward for your specific area. And then we hop on a phone call together and I answer any questions you might have, clarify anything that you didn't understand in that report, and just really make sure that you feel confident going into your area, right? And, if you're looking for daily accountability and a place to connect with a lot of other hunters, elk hunters, mule deer hunters, bear hunters, I'd really encourage you to join me on Team Backbone. I try to be active in that group on a daily basis. We cover a ton of scenarios. You're going to get access to a ton of my different writing pieces. And that's the way for you to connect with me on a daily basis and be able to plan your hunt even more and get all of your questions answered. Now, on top of that, I do have my elk hunting ebooks that you've probably seen me talk about before. Those are a great resource for anybody that wants to polish their knowledge on elk behavior and terrain and help them put their plan together as well. Get those on Backbone Unlimited as well. We've got our bugle tubes and reeds out this year. These are Backbone Unlimited exclusive, so you can only get them at backboneunlimited.com. We've sold out of the first run of reeds, and we're actually on run number 2, and we're over 50% sold out on our tubes. So if you're interested in grabbing one of those, I would grab it now because they are going to sell out before season. If you need help with training plans or nutrition, I would really encourage you to tap into my 30 plus years of experience as a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach. I'd love to help get you squared away there, get you a plan where you feel confident in what you're doing is actually preparing you for mountain hunting. Let me know if you have any questions at all. If you have questions you want featured in a video, let me know. Please hit me up in the comments. I read and respond to all of them. Thank you for being here. I appreciate each and every one of you. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.